The day Ethan Vale walked out of the prison gates, not a single member of the Blackthorne family came to meet him. 6 years earlier, they had built a wall of fabricated evidence around him, branded him an embezzler, seized the conglomerate his father had spent a lifetime building, and erased his name from every inheritance document that mattered. The black sedan waiting at the curb now belonged to an investment fund that had quietly purchased a controlling stake in Blackthorne Industries, while Ethan sat behind bars. When he stepped into that boardroom the following morning, the people who had sentenced him stood frozen. The man they had destroyed had come back as their new boss. Stay with this story until the end to watch Ethan Vale reclaim his empire without losing the one thing no one could take from him. 17 years before the arrest, Ethan Vale had taken his father's regional freight operation and rebuilt it into something the industry barely had language for. Vale Dominion Group controlled airport logistics corridors across 11 states, managed fuel optimization networks for 3 of the country's largest carriers, and had just finalized contracts with 2 major port authorities when Graham Vale's heart finally failed him in the spring boardroom of the building he had named after no one, but kept immaculate out of quiet pride. Ethan had been at his father's side in that room, running through quarterly projections, and the doctors said Graham was gone before the papers hit the floor. The loss hit Ethan in a way that had no business equivalent, because Graham had been both the company's founder and the only person whose judgment Ethan had ever trusted entirely, and those 2 things had always been impossible to separate in his mind. In the weeks that followed, the preliminary reading of Graham's will suggested what most inside the company had assumed for years. Ethan would receive 51% of voting shares, Celeste would be secured financially for the rest of her life, and Victoria and Grant Blackthorne would retain their executive roles without gaining controlling interest. The arrangement made sense to everyone who understood how Graham had structured the company and why, but sense was not the currency the Blackthornes dealt in. 3 days before the ownership transfer was scheduled to be completed, the company's internal audit team flagged an anomaly that stopped every conversation in the building. $48 million had moved out of the airport expansion fund in a series of transactions spread across 6 weeks, each one carrying Ethan's digital signature, his authentication codes, and his executive access credentials. Victoria called an emergency session of the board within the hour, arriving with a composure that Ethan would later understand had been rehearsed many times before that morning. She stood before the assembled directors and asked Ethan, in front of every person whose opinion would shape the next 72 hours, why money from the company's infrastructure reserve had flowed into shell corporations with filings that listed his name in the ownership structure. Ethan had not yet had time to pull a single transaction record when the federal agents arrived at the boardroom door, already informed, already carrying paperwork, already certain of what they intended to do. The press corps was waiting in the building's main lobby before anyone on Ethan's side had made a single call, which told him everything about how long this had been planned and how little time he had been given to respond. Grant Blackthorne crossed the room, placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, and murmured with practiced grief that he would look after Camille while this was sorted out. Ethan looked at the hand on his shoulder, then at the agents by the door, then at Victoria's carefully arranged expression of sorrowful necessity, and understood with complete clarity that this was not an investigation. It was a public execution, staged in the one place that would make him look guilty before any evidence was examined, and the people who had orchestrated it had been thorough enough to make sure Jonah Reed, the company's head of cybersecurity, had already signed a server log that placed Ethan alone at the system terminal on the night the money disappeared. The trial lasted 11 days, and every hour of it was theater designed for an audience that had already decided the ending. Victoria appeared before cameras on the courthouse steps each morning, dressed in the understated authority of someone reluctantly forced to clean up another person's catastrophic failure, framing each appearance as the story of a female executive protecting a corporation from the greed of the man who should have led it. The prosecution built its case in layers that interlocked with the precision of something assembled over months rather than weeks. Ethan's digital signature on every transfer, corporate entities bearing his name in their registration filings, emails retrieved from his account suggesting he had explored opportunities abroad, Jonah's technical testimony confirming that only Ethan's credentials had accessed the relevant systems on the relevant nights, and a recorded conversation in which Ethan's voice said clearly that he intended to take back everything that belonged to him. That recording had been extracted from a longer dispute about intellectual property rights and stripped of every syllable that gave it context. But the jury heard only the version that served the prosecution's narrative, and context is almost impossible to restore once a room has decided what it already believes. Mara Quinn, who had served as Vale Dominion's senior legal counsel and had refused to sign the internal report that condemned Ethan, found something in the technical evidence that the prosecution had chosen not to highlight. The transfer transactions had originated from a maintenance terminal, a device used for system diagnostic that had no legitimate reason to carry executive approval authority, and the network signature did not match Ethan's office workstation by any forensic standard. She brought this to the court's attention and then watched the maintenance terminal disappear from the evidence catalog before she could request independent analysis. She filed 3 emergency motions in 4 days, lost each one on procedural grounds that her opponents had prepared months in advance, which told her something important about how deep the coordination around this case actually ran. When Ethan was offered a plea arrangement that would reduce his sentence to 3 years, he refused without hesitation, because accepting that arrangement meant leaving Camille with a father's name attached permanently to a guilty verdict, and he was not willing to do that to her, regardless of what it cost him personally. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on charges of financial fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice, and the sentence was 6 years in federal custody. Within 48 hours of the verdict, Conrad Blackthorne activated a clause buried deep in the family trust documentations, specifying that any heir convicted of a felony would forfeit voting rights. A trust amendment materialized from somewhere in the legal record, transferring those shares to Celeste and her children, and Vale Dominion Group was renamed Blackthorne Dominion before the month was finished. Ethan was escorted to the transport vehicle while Victoria stood on the courthouse steps and told the cameras that the company had finally been purified. Before the transport door closed, Mara pressed close enough to speak quietly, telling Ethan that the signature on the trust amendment did not match the handwriting in any other document his father had ever produced. Ethan arrived at the federal facility carrying rage and the absolute conviction that his first appeal would succeed within a year. The appeals were filed, reviewed, and rejected in sequence, each denial citing insufficient new evidence, and the system moved with the indifference of something that had no mechanism for caring whether the original verdict was correct. He stopped fighting the anger somewhere in the second year, not because he accepted what had happened, but because he recognized that anger was burning resources he needed for something more useful. The prison library had a legal section that most inmates ignored, and Ethan spent his mornings there, working through the financial and trust law he had never needed to understand as an executive, because other people had managed those structures on his behalf, and he spent his afternoons reconstructing from memory the architecture of every major transaction Vale Dominion had executed in the 3 years before his arrest. He also spent those afternoons understanding how the case against him had been assembled, because a man who has been framed in one structure can only protect himself from the next one if he understands exactly how the first one worked. Camille called when she could and visited twice in 6 years, and both times she was composed in a way that told him she had worked very hard to prepare for the conversation and had probably spent the drive over deciding what to say and what not to say in front of the corrections officers. He never let her see how each visit made the weight heavier rather than lighter, because she was already carrying what had been done to their family, and he was not willing to add his grief to what she was managing. After her second visit, he spent the rest of that evening in the library and decided the most important thing he could do for her was not survive the sentence but build something during it that could not be taken again. Mara wrote to him 8 months into the second year with information that changed the geometry of everything he had been thinking about. Before Vale Dominion had a name or a single contract, Ethan had spent 4 years developing a routing and optimization system called Atlas Grid, a software architecture that calculated the most efficient integration of flight corridors, fuel consumption, cargo timing, and supply chain logistics in real time. Graham had recognized early that Atlas Grid was worth more than any single contract the company would ever sign, and he had insisted that its patents be registered separately from Vale Dominion's corporate structure, held in a personal trust that belonged to Ethan and Camille independent of any inheritance proceeding or corporate restructuring. The Blackthorns had taken the company. They had no legal claim to Atlas Grid. From a federal prison, working through Mara as his authorized representative, Ethan signed licensing agreements that allowed her to form a commercial entity called North Star Systems and begin deploying Atlas Grid to clients who had been watching the technology from a distance for years. Lionel Ashcroft signed the first major contract within 60 days, and his global freight network's operating costs dropped by figures that made other carriers request meetings immediately. Ports, airlines, and regional carriers followed, and North Star Systems grew in the deliberate quiet of a company that had no interest in attracting attention. Ethan took nothing from the revenue except what covered legal expenses and a fund designated for Camille's education and security. Everything else was reinvested through a holding structure called North Star Equity, which Mara managed with the help of 2 financial architects whose names were not in any public filing associated with Ethan Vale. Mara's letter in the 3rd year did not contain congratulations or optimism. It contained a single line noting that Blackthorn Dominion had begun borrowing from institutional lenders, and that one of those lenders had recently sold a portion of its position to a fund whose beneficial ownership was protected by a trust instrument. The Blackthorns had never understood that the thing most dangerous about Ethan Vale was not his anger but his patience. While he was reading trust law in a prison library, Victoria was acquiring companies that had no strategic relationship to Blackthorn Dominion's core operations, funding the purchases with short-term debt instruments she intended to refinance once the acquisitions improved the company's public profile enough to attract better terms. Grant was running a parallel operation inside the corporate treasury, routing infrastructure project funds into subsidiaries, controlled by friends and relatives at margins that would eventually become impossible to explain in any legitimate audit. They organized events at venues that cost more than Graham Vale had spent on equipment in his first 5 years of operations, attached the Blackthorn name to a sports complex and a waterfront development project, and allowed the engineering teams that had kept Vale Dominion's airport systems running at the technical standards Ethan had established to resign without replacement or retention effort. The cracks appeared in the 4th year of Ethan's sentence. Airport terminal projects falling behind schedule by months and then by quarters, A pension fund audit revealing that retirement contributions had been redirected into real estate vehicles connected to the Blackthorne family. Three of the company's largest carrier clients, notifying management that they were evaluating Atlas Grid licensing through Northstar Systems as a replacement for systems they had originally built in partnership with Vale Dominion, and major lending institutions beginning to request collateral adjustments on the debt that had funded Victoria's acquisition campaign. Northstar Equity, operating through intermediaries and identified in no filing by any name connected to Ethan, began purchasing those debt positions from banks that wanted to reduce their exposure to a company whose fundamentals were deteriorating faster than its press releases acknowledged. Grant approved additional borrowing from what he described to his sister as an aggressive but straightforward private equity fund seeking yield in the infrastructure sector, never investigating who actually controlled the beneficial interest behind the clean documentation Mara's team produced. 3 months before Ethan's scheduled release date, Blackthorne Dominion triggered a technical covenant default on obligations that Northstar Equity now held in substantial quantity. The conversion rights embedded in those instruments allowed the fund to exchange a portion of the debt for equity, and when combined with shares that had been accumulated through open market purchases over the preceding 18 months, Northstar Equity's total position represented 52% of voting authority in what had been renamed from Graham Vale's original company. Victoria instructed her legal team to investigate the fund's ownership structure and received back a report showing Mara Quinn and Lionel Ashcroft as the named representatives in all disclosed filings, which told her almost nothing useful and left her unable to determine whether she was facing an opportunistic acquisition or something more deliberately engineered. The morning Ethan walked out, Mara was waiting with a black sedan, a new suit in a garment bag folded across the back seat, a phone with encrypted access already configured, and a folder containing a single document. The document described the executive structure of Northstar Equity, listed the fund's current holdings and their approximate market value of $1.8 billion, and identified the fund's controlling principal as Ethan Vale, chairman. He read it once, set it on the seat beside him, and asked Mara what time the board meeting started. She told him Victoria had convened the directors at 9 in the morning for the explicit purpose of removing Northstar's representatives from any position of governance influence before a formal ownership challenge could be mounted. The building's lobby security officer did not recognize the man who walked through the main entrance with a leather portfolio and no entourage, and the floor manager was already composing a request for Ethan to wait in the visitor area when Mara spoke 3 sentences that caused every person within earshot to go very still. The boardroom on the 38th floor was in the middle of what Victoria had framed as an emergency governance review. Her presentation arguing that Northstar was a predatory fund seeking to strip the company's most profitable divisions and sell them separately to recover the value of its debt position. Grant had spent the first 40 minutes of the meeting projecting confidence, assuring the assembled directors that the fund's ownership stake could be challenged on procedural grounds that his legal team had already begun to document, and that a favorable ruling would restore the board's operational autonomy within 60 to 90 days. The people in that room had known Grant for years and had learned that his confidence was loudest precisely when he was most uncertain, but none of them had yet figured out how to price that information correctly. The door opened, and Ethan walked in, and the room experienced the particular silence that happens when reality arrives to correct a version of events that had been presented with great conviction. Victoria's presentation was still on the screen behind her. Grant's pen was in his hand, and it fell from his fingers and made a small sound on the table that no one acknowledged. Ethan placed the debt conversion documentation and the voting rights summary on the table in front of the board chair, said that the meeting could continue on its original agenda, and then said that the vote tallies had changed and that everyone present should be aware of the current ownership structure before proceeding with any resolutions. He did not raise his voice, did not make a speech, did not look at Victoria or Grant with anything that could be described as triumph, and did not sit at the head of the table immediately, which confused everyone in the room because they had been prepared for rage and received composure instead. The transfer of executive authority was formalized with 52% of the vote, and the man who had been escorted from this building in handcuffs 6 years earlier became, in the language of the corporate resolution Mara had already drafted, the acting executive chairman of what had been his father's company. He did not terminate Victoria or Grant in that meeting. He suspended their authorization to transfer, encumber, or dispose of any company asset above a threshold that made most executive decisions subject to his countersignature, and he announced that an independent audit committee would be constituted within the week with authority to examine every transaction from the preceding 6 years. The decision to leave them in place rather than remove them immediately was not mercy, and it was not hesitation. It was the recognition that people under investigation who still hold titles continue to produce evidence, while people who have already been fired have much stronger motivation to destroy it. He met with the company's operational staff in 3 sessions that day, telling them that no manufacturing facility or regional hub would close to service the Blackthorne family's debt, that payroll was secured through Northstar's assets for a minimum of 6 months regardless of what the audit uncovered, and that their pension contributions would be the first liability addressed from any recovery. Victoria responded that evening by releasing to the financial press a letter she described as written by Graham Vale, in which Graham allegedly accused Ethan of misappropriating company funds and expressed the wish that Ethan not inherit control of the enterprise. Conrad appeared at a televised analyst briefing and suggested that a convicted felon leveraging offshore capital to seize a public-adjacent company raised questions that regulators should examine immediately, and the financial press devoted 2 full days to asking whether Ethan Vale's return was redemption or a more sophisticated form of the same ambition that had landed him in prison in the first place. The pressure arrived from every direction simultaneously and did not stop. Institutional investors called to express concern about governance stability. 2 banking relationships requested in-person meetings to discuss covenant compliance. A segment of the workforce that had been hired during the Blackthorne years and knew Ethan only as the name attached to a fraud case from before their employment began circulated a petition asking the board to delay any structural changes pending regulatory review. Ethan responded to none of it with public statements and responded to all of it with a written stabilization plan filed directly with the board. Northstar's assets securing payroll and benefits for 6 months regardless of audit outcomes, a moratorium on the sale of any core operational business unit, the independent audit committee constituted immediately with 3 external members whose names had been selected by the company's largest non-Blackthorne institutional shareholders, an invitation to employee representatives to participate in restructuring discussions, and a declaration that Ethan would draw no salary, bonus, or executive compensation until the company returned to profitable operation for 2 consecutive quarters. The plan moved through the workforce faster than any press release could have managed, because it was specific and because it was binding. Mara's forensic review of the Graham Vale letter produced results within 72 hours. A document authentication specialist confirmed that the letter had been printed using a version of document preparation software that had not been released until 14 months after Graham's death meaning the content was fabricated, even if the physical signature on it had originated from a page Graham had signed for an entirely different purpose. The finding established that someone had maintained a supply of pre-signed blank pages bearing Graham's signature and had used one to create a document bearing whatever content served their purpose at any given moment. The bribery approach came through an intermediary connected to a real estate fund with documented ties to Blackthorne family members. Camille received a written offer of $5 million in exchange for a public statement that her father had privately admitted guilt to her at some point during his incarceration. She forwarded every document she received to Mara without responding to a single one, and she called Ethan that evening and told him she wanted him to know she had done it before he heard about it from anyone else. She asked nothing about the offer and expressed no doubt about what she had chosen, which told Ethan more about what his daughter had become in 6 years than anything else that had happened since the morning he walked out. An anonymous data package arrived at Northstar's secure inbox containing 2 words and a hyphenated number, Orchard 9. Ethan stared at the message for a long time before he understood what it meant, because Orchard 9 was the internal designation for an air-gapped backup server that had been installed in an off-site warehouse facility during the early years of Vale Dominion's operations, back when the company was small enough that Graham had handled infrastructure personally and had insisted on physical redundancy for every system that touched financial records. 3 people had ever known that name: Ethan, his father, and the man who had built and maintained the system. Ethan pulled the security footage from the building's exterior cameras for the preceding 48 hours and found a single frame showing Jonah Reed standing across the street for 11 minutes before walking away. The meeting happened at a decommissioned rail depot that Jonah had chosen for reasons that became obvious when Ethan arrived. No cameras, no foot traffic, no ambient noise, no witnesses who were not present by choice. Jonah looked like a man who had spent 6 years being slowly eaten by something he could not name but could not stop feeling, which was accurate. He said he had been waiting for Ethan to come back, not because he believed things would necessarily go better, but because he had decided he was no longer willing to carry what he was carrying inside his own head for whatever remaining years he had. He told Ethan everything in the order it had happened, without softening any of it. Grant had exploited Jonah's highest-level system administrator credentials to access the corporate authentication architecture on a Sunday evening when no technical staff were scheduled. Using Jonah's access, he had cloned Ethan's digital signature profile, his authentication tokens, and his executive approval codes, then executed $48 million in transfers through the maintenance terminal that had briefly appeared in and then disappeared from the evidence inventory. After completing the transactions, Grant had corrected the system logs to show the activity as originating from Ethan's office workstation during business hours, a modification that required the exact level of access that Jonah's position provided, and that Jonah himself would have been uniquely positioned to execute if someone who knew the system wanted to ensure the modification was not flagged by automated monitoring. When Jonah discovered what had happened by tracing an anomaly in the server timestamps, Conrad summoned him to a meeting that lasted 18 minutes and offered him a choice: confirm the story that placed Ethan at the terminal, or become the person the investigation identified as the only system administrator with the technical ability to have manipulated the records. Jonah had a daughter in her 2nd year of college, no savings to speak of, and a brother who worked in the same industry and whose career would be affected by association with a financial crime conviction. He chose to protect himself and the people around him, and that choice sent Ethan Vale to prison for 6 years. He had kept a local backup of the original server logs before delivering the modified version to investigators, storing it at Orchard 9 without telling anyone, because some part of him needed to know the real record still existed somewhere, even if he never used it. The backup contained original timestamps, original network routing data showing the maintenance terminal's IP address as the transaction source, and Grant's login sequence from the stolen credentials appearing in the activity log 9 minutes before the first transfer began. Victoria, Jonah told Ethan, had also recently discovered that Grant had been moving money into personal accounts structured to survive the company's insolvency, and that he had established a residency arrangement in a jurisdiction without a formal extradition relationship with the United States. She had gone to Conrad with the information and been told that Grant's personal financial planning was not her concern, and that her role was to manage the public face of the company through whatever came next. That conversation had apparently clarified for Victoria that Conrad had never considered her the heir to anything. She was the face. She was the signature on the documents. She was the one who would absorb the legal consequences when the structure finally became impossible to maintain. Jonah said he would testify to everything he had just said, under oath, in any proceeding that asked him to, with one condition. He wanted the low-level technical staff who had been ordered to assist with log modifications under threat of termination to be treated as coerced rather than criminal participants. Ethan told him that was not a condition he needed to negotiate, because it was already what he intended. Conrad convened the emergency shareholder meeting at the largest hotel in Bellhaven with the explicit purpose of using a morality clause in the company's governance charter to disqualify a person with a felony conviction from serving as executive chairman of a company holding government-adjacent infrastructure contracts. The argument was procedurally coherent, legally supportable in the abstract, and politically framed to make Ethan's attempt to reclaim the company look like the aggression of a convicted criminal using financial leverage to circumvent legitimate governance. Conrad arrived with a team of attorneys, a prepared presentation, and the confidence of a man who had spent 4 decades making rooms bend to his preferences before the meeting started. Grant had convinced himself that the strength of their procedural argument combined with the momentum of the media narrative would carry the day, and he arrived looking like a man who had already decided where he was having dinner afterward. Ethan let them present everything. He sat in his chair at the table, made no interruptions, asked no questions, and gave Conrad and Grant the full duration of their allotted time to make every argument they had prepared, which was a form of patience that made several board members visibly uneasy because it did not match the behavior of someone who was losing. When Conrad concluded, Mara walked to the front of the room with 3 documents in her hands and placed them on the presentation table where Conrad's materials had been arranged. The first document was a certified copy of the original server logs recovered from Orchard 9. Authenticated by an independent forensic technology firm whose credentials were listed on the accompanying certification page. The second document was a forensic analysis of the Graham Vale letter Victoria had released to the press and the trust amendment that had been used to strip Ethan's voting rights, establishing that both had been constructed using documents bearing Graham's genuine signature that had been repurposed for fabricated content, and that the amendment bore a notarization date that could not be reconciled with the notary's own records for that period. The third document was a certified copy of the appellate court's ruling issued 41 hours earlier, vacating Ethan's conviction on the grounds that material evidence had been fabricated and withheld, that a key witness had given testimony he now attested under penalty of perjury was coerced and false, and that the integrity of the original proceeding could not be sustained given the scope of the documented misconduct. Jonah appeared by video, read his prepared statement, and answered questions from the attorneys present for 90 minutes. Victoria opened a leather portfolio she had brought to the meeting and placed a recording device on the table. The audio it contained was from a meeting she had attended in Conrad's home 18 months before Graham Vale's death, in which Conrad had outlined the mechanism by which the felony provision in the trust could be triggered and explained that the critical timing requirement was ensuring the provision was activated before the will was probated. Grant stood up from his chair and walked toward the exit and was met by two federal agents who had been waiting in the corridor with documentation from a court that had been reviewing sealed materials for 11 days. There was no physical confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic scene. Grant simply stopped walking, looked at the agents, and then looked back at the room where the people he had spent years impressing were watching him run out of options in real time. Ethan was confirmed by vote as executive chairman. He did not use his voting authority to liquidate the Blackthorne family's remaining positions or to pursue civil claims that could have been filed immediately. He transferred the complete evidentiary package to the Federal Investigative Authority and the State Attorney General's office and said publicly that justice required an independent process and that he had no interest in being both the aggrieved party and the judge. Celeste asked for a private meeting the same evening, and Ethan granted it without conditions. She was 64 years old and looked older than that, and she began the conversation by saying that she had made a decision decades ago that she had told herself was about survival and had recently come to understand was about cowardice. Graham had spent the last 8 months of his life methodically building a case against Conrad's use of the company's financial architecture for Blackthorne family benefit, intending to remove Conrad from the board and restore the ownership structure to what the original partnership agreements specified. He had prepared a final will that formalized Ethan's control position and included a detailed letter to his son explaining the decision, and he had told no one he had done it because he understood that announcing your intentions to people who have reason to oppose them is not wisdom, but invitation. 3 weeks before Graham's death, Conrad had presented Celeste with a version of events in which her financial security and her children's positions depended entirely on her willingness to allow a document substitution that would look, from the outside, like a standard estate amendment. She had removed the final will from Graham's personal safe and allowed Conrad to replace it with the version that eventually activated the felony clause. Graham's final will established Ethan's ownership of 51% of Vale Dominion without condition or provision for forfeiture, and it included a private letter that said nothing about buildings, balance sheets, or strategic direction. Graham wrote that he had watched Ethan run the company for 17 years and had seen him make decisions that prioritized the people who depended on the company over his own comfort and convenience more times than he could count. And he said that whatever Ethan chose to do with what he was leaving him, he hoped his son would remember that every machine, in every hangar and every route in every system existed because thousands of people had given their working lives to make it function, and that power was only worth having if the person holding it understood that clearly. The criminal referrals proceeded from the investigative authorities' findings. Grant charged with financial fraud, evidence fabrication, obstruction of justice, and breach of fiduciary duty. Conrad charged with conspiracy to commit theft by deception, witness coercion, and fraudulent conveyance. Victoria required to cooperate with the investigation, surrender all compensation and equity received through transactions now characterized as fraudulent, and resign from every position she held in the company's governance structure. Celeste required to return real property and equity interests traceable to the misappropriated estate assets. Jonah Reed required to make a full formal statement to the court and held jointly responsible for his false testimony, while receiving consideration for his voluntary cooperation and the critical evidence his preservation of the Orchard 9 backup had made available. The appellate ruling restored Ethan's legal standing. The combination of North Star Equities holdings and the shares, returned to proper ownership, gave him a controlling position in what had been his father's company that exceeded anything Graham's will alone would have conveyed. He stood for an hour that night in his hotel room, looking at figures that represented the largest single accumulation of corporate power in the company's history, concentrated in the hands of one person. And he thought about Conrad, who had spent decades doing exactly this and had believed it was what winning looked like. The company was renamed Vail North Star Group, and the restructuring was announced in a document that ran to 30 pages of operational specifics and 4 sentences of personal statement from Ethan, who said he was aware that rebuilding trust required actions rather than promises, and that the actions would be visible and auditable from the first day. He retained sufficient voting authority to ensure the company's long-term direction could not be altered by a coalition of short-term interests, but transferred a significant block of shares into an employee ownership trust, structured to vest over 4 years, weighted toward the workers in logistics, maintenance, and field operations who had the least visibility in corporate governance decisions and the most direct relationship to whether the company actually functioned. The pension fund's remaining shortfall was eliminated using assets recovered from the Blackthorne family's compelled divestiture, which meant the people who had been most harmed by the fund's misuse were also the first people made whole, and Ethan made sure every employee received written confirmation of the restoration before any announcement went to the financial press. Every acquisition made by Victoria that could not be justified on operational grounds was sold, and the proceeds reduced the debt that had accumulated while the Blackthorns ran the company. The fleet of private aircraft was auctioned. The waterfront naming rights were declined. Blackthorn Dominion's branded signage came down from 3 facilities in the first month, and nothing with Ethan's name went up in its place because he told the communications team that the company did not need to explain who was in charge through the size of the letters on the building. Mara was appointed to a newly created position as independent general counsel, reporting to the full board rather than to the chairman's office, with a mandate that explicitly included reviewing any transaction that the chairman himself proposed above a certain threshold. The arrangement was unusual, and the board questioned whether it was necessary, and Ethan said that the most important governance structure any company could have was one that treated its leader as equally capable of error as anyone else. One terminal at the company's original freight hub was left with the name it had carried since the building was constructed. The brass lettering above the gate read Graham Vale Freight Terminal, and it was the same building where Graham had started the company with 6 leased trucks and a rented loading dock 41 years earlier. Camille came to the terminal on the evening of the formal relaunch ceremony after most of the guests had left, and she and Ethan stood in the main bay while the last of the catering staff moved equipment through the space. She asked him whether getting it all back made the 6 years feel like less of what they actually were. He told her that nothing that had happened in the last 18 months had given him back the morning she visited him in the prison facility and tried to hold her expressions steady for his sake, and that he had stopped expecting compensation of that kind a long time ago. She asked him if he was finished with it. He looked at the workers finishing their evening shift on the loading platform, people who had been employed here for years, and who were going home tonight to families who did not have to worry about whether the company would exist next month. And he said that what he had wanted to take from the Blackthorns had ended on the day he had the power to destroy them completely and chose to hand the evidence to people whose job it was to pursue justice instead. On a morning 6 weeks later, Ethan drove to a meeting on the other side of the city and passed the federal facility where he had spent 6 years learning patience and reading trust law in a library most people walked past without stopping. He did not slow down, did not look at the gates as he passed them, and did not think about what had happened inside them in any way that interrupted the conversation he was having through the car's speakers with an engineer who wanted to walk him through a proposed expansion of Atlas Grid's maritime routing capability. The road took him past the gates and away from them, and he kept moving, the way a man moves when he has already decided that what is behind him belongs to the past, and what is in front of him is the only direction worth looking. They had thought 6 years behind iron and concrete had made Ethan Vale a man with nothing left to lose. They had never understood that in those 6 years he had become the one man left that no one would ever be able to take anything from again.